he was, among other things, a kind of finishing school for me. I thought only 2 years older than me, but he was my unpaid professor, unacknowledged.
On everything, right?
Professor Durst. Mm-hmm. Well, trying to teach us all the traditional forms, Spencerian sonnets, and haikus or whatever, and trying to get us to write in form instead of free verse. That's something that certainly happened to all of us that lived with him at the Shermitage, a house on Sherman Street that was owned by Ron Nelson, that we all lived in, and had a sense of being a collective and being on some kind of mission, thus the sort of religio sounding name of the whole thing. In fact, I noticed that this Love Sonnets by Stephen Durst is published by Shermitage Red Wing Press, 956 Sherman Street. That was the Shermitage.
Wow.
We did community gardening and had a weekly salon of music and poetry and frivolity. I've been asked to read the valediction at the last page of this book. Valediction. I used to tight walk rails barefoot for miles, rolling my eyes in painful figures 8, books on my head remembering your smiles. I used to preach on the streets and wait to see the heavens crack, hear shouts resound. I thought the eschaton would take the bait. I used to sit at a piano and pound out scales and chords hour by hour, hoping the lost one would bring you around. I studied all the ends and means of power, the reasons for great rises and declines, and shoveled shit to make anarchy flower. But now I'm weary of walking straight lines. I'll do something weird and see if it shines. Well, I must say that this is an example of what I was saying about Stephen being a professor for me. So I studied all the ends and means of power, the reasons for great rises and declines, and shoveled shit to make anarchy flower. That's what I've held on to the last 30 years to keep myself going through various hardships. If I got caught up in my personal worries, problems, or whatever, I'd say, yeah, but what am I going to do to overthrow military industrial death culture? And focus on that wider good and, that study that's in that stanza.
Back in about 50 years ago, I bought an old house up on Newberry Hill overlooking Belknap Park, and it had an old piano in it. And so I was blessed a few times with him pounding away on it. Mm-hmm. I'm glad to be here because on the poetry, I haven't read one word of that. So I'm amiss that way, but tickled to hear what he's talking about there, and also his close friend, as a close friend of mine, Rick, or rather Ralph Todd now. And then about 30 years ago, I moved out on a lake, and the Grand River 15 feet back, and a lake 100 feet in front, and it had a piano. And so I had the joy of him knocking on the keys a couple times there. It seems like over the years, so many events that he would be there. And that was pleasing. I missed his get together of his memorial service and felt bad about that, because one thing I would have liked to have seen all the people, because I've been somewhat out of circulation the last half dozen years. So with that, I'm going to hear, and also I'm going to enjoy looking at this. I'll pass.
Well, I first met Stephen at a Twilight Tribe poetry reading being held at the Reptile House, a building which is no longer there. I think the first time I met him, I also saw him in full nudity. I believe that at that poetry reading, he stripped down and then recited. So I think I saw him naked the first time I met him.
It was Walt Whitman's birthday.
Oh, that's right. It was Walt Whitman's birthday. That's right. And and I thought that he seemed to be a kind of arrogant, and I had a judgmental attitude towards him because he I don't know, it just seemed so bold and yeah, but yeah, really fascinating and compelling from the first, really.
He said, "This is for you, Walt." After, I remember really enjoying it, that night. Like he read a lot of Walt Whitman poetry, and then at the end, took off all his clothes and said, "This is for you, Walt." It wasn't so shocking, or stuff went on there that was kind of wild, but
it was the Reptile House after all.
It makes me wonder, was I there or was I already gone? Because so many things like that happened there. And Stephen, I'll just share that I don't remember the first time I met Stephen exactly, but I lived at Durst's house, Helen's house, and he played piano all the time, all hours. And it didn't bother me at all. And the conversations we had were brushes with poetry or brushes with philosophy. I don't remember having a conversation with Stephen that was concrete. What struck me about my relationship with Stephen, or conversations with Stephen, is that there were always brushes with ideas flowing into other ideas, kind of leading into another place. And I never, in all of those exchanges, I never got around to a concrete conversation. And I thought, what is this? It always took me on a journey, or was educational in some way. It was a contemplation, and then I was going to college, so I would take some of the things he said, or the small exchange that I would have with him, or just a few glimpses into something that he felt about something, and I would take it into getting myself to school and getting back. It was like living with Stephen was like kind of living with this philosophical, poetic vibration. Not so formed. It's funny that you would think that he was, what do you call it? Your impression of him, Ralph, was that he was, thought highly of himself.
Yeah, puffed up, or yeah.
Because that was not my experience of him at all. There was such a softness.
Yeah, well, I learned that part too. although there certainly could be a harshness too. It's something to be said as well, is that both just in general his willingness to say what needed to be said in his opinion in the moment, but also in relationship to whiskey, that he could get kind of brutal. There was some he would get very confrontational with me sometimes about my religiosity, and kind of would come at that with some bite.
I think of at the house, he ate eggs with the shells on them. Ate hard-boiled eggs. Just with the saying that calcium's good for you. And I still do that to this day, just to get a rise out of people. They just go, no. It crunches, and it's not. Often you can't get it out of the shell anyway. And he ate garlic whole too.
There's so much of him that
Mm-hmm.
came into me as it became a part of my routine.
Yeah.
Eating raw garlic, and I still don't eat eggs with shells, although I try it periodically.
There was something, I think it was Mark Zabatowski was leading this ritual, in the garage, and I was kind of scared. But personally, it was some of that stuff was kind of new to me, and and we were all drinking, and I don't know who it was. Somebody kept spitting beer on the floor and offering it to Jim Morrison. and it got kind of heavy, right? And he's wearing this purple robe. And
Stephen.
No, Mark Zabatowski was leading this long earth ritual, and it was on the equinox, right? It was on the equinox, and we were up all night, right? And I said, I had been in there, and I was outside, and it's I'm not going in there. And Steve Durst got behind me and just pushed me lightly and said, as poets, we have to experience these things. And I went in, but it's oh boy. And then Helen rounded out the evening with yelling at us out of the window, saying you guys, shut up, you're keeping me awake. So the first time I saw Steve, I didn't know him, and I was with this guy that I worked in those group homes, and he was kind of a Republican guy that I worked with. He was a little bit alternative, but he was to the right? And he goes, and we're going into Easttown with the van, and he goes, look, Craig, those look like some of your friends, right? and Steve Durst was with Helen. He was just walking with Helen, I think, and he just had on this big hat. And I remember looking at them and thinking I want them to be my friends, I was kind of leaving the mainstream sort in my mind, in my life, and I just thought I want them to be my friends, and I said, yeah, those do look like my friends, so that's the first time I saw him. I wrote notes here.
You created him. You invoked him.
Well, I'd like to point out one of the secrets to Stephen's success as a poet is that he was a horrible thief as far as the muse. When living at the Shermitage with him, during conversation on a regular, a poetic idea would happen in the room, in the conversation. Any one of us might have sort of gotten the ball rolling on that. And like a gunfighter, he would be the quickest on the draw. He would, and it really put a lot of pressure on the rest of us to get that down before Stephen writes it. once the muse had provided the poetic inspiration in our midst, if you didn't snatch it, Stephen was gonna turn it into verse before you had a chance. One of Stephen's great contributions while we lived there together was, while the rest of us sat down for meals together, he would sit at the piano and improvise on piano while singing the Psalms. And that would be our meal accompaniment. And then after we had finished eating, he would eat his meal. Always ate after us.
That's pretty
Wow.
deep.
That's really, it's really holy. That's the thing, it's like the holy through the ridiculous, I mean, there's a quality of holy through the outrageous.
No, it was a great coup for me as well when Stephen said, I've got to have a place to put my piano. It's 4 blocks away. And so we pushed his piano down the street, down Division, to the Enclave, and installed his piano at the Enclave. That was his personal instrument that sat in the Enclave. The former Enclave building has offices for living downtown. At the other end of the block was the Reptile House, which had previously been the Glass Bar, which was destroyed by a contractor who wasn't paid, and so he cut through all the roof joists and put the building in a dumpster. Anyway, just an aside.
Wow.
It's a nice little park now, a little postage stamp park. So yeah, the Enclave was more a anarchist experiment than a business venture. It was my idea, but as I always said from the beginning, it isn't mine, it's ours. That the concept was that we would be a place where the different scenes can come together. So I wanted it to be a poetry space, a folk music space, a jazz music space, and a punk rock space. As it happens, punk rock tends to just take over, which is how it sort of ended towards the end of just being a punk venue. But we certainly had all of that there. I lived in a tent in the building, and the building was half a ruin at the time. Much of it caved in ceilings and roofs in what had been the hotel and space upstairs and stuff. But so Stephen had originally provided the $2,000 as startup money. He had gotten an inheritance, and he provided the $2,000 to start it up. Wouldn't have happened without him, in that very practical sense. Unfortunately, the Twilight Tribe had been wiped out just prior to opening up the Enclave, and I had counted on the Twilight Tribe being the anchor group for poetry at the Enclave. What took its place was Soothsayers, which at the time was a newer poetry group, but not as vested in my project as what I had hoped Twilight Tribe would have been. But Stephen was very often there, very often at the piano, playing with other people in all kinds of avant-garde jazz ensembles. Lots of conversations until the crack of dawn. I remember we were talking one evening about what could be broadly termed like Illuminati conspiracy stuff, and I left to go for a walk under the full moon, and in an alley a couple blocks away, I found a large format antique book that was ABCs in the School of the Holy Spirit for children or something, but it was Freemasonic, alchemic pedagogy on the subject that Stephen and I had been discussing. I had years before read Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco, which is on that subject, and it's an existential novel that leaves you without a resolution to the question of whether there's occult cabals secretly driving politics. And I became quite obsessed with it and was researching it for years. And just like happens in the novel, all these synchronicities start to occur to you when you start to research these things. And so it was just another in a long series of confirmations for me. And now I feel like it's come full circle. It's one of the things I'm sad about Stephen's passing, is I would love so much to be able to talk about these things with him now. So yeah, it was very often very heady with Stephen, and you could go very, very long and deep into lots of subjects.
At a party at Paris House on Kellogg Street, a commune that I was fortunate to live in for a little while, that came out in the black because we didn't have to pay rent. Anyway, Steve showed me Taoist hand gestures, and I just remember that.
He did those. He
Yeah.
showed the Taoist hand gestures, just like that poem. He would put books on his head at home. He would stand on. I mean, it was just living in the same house. He was frequently doing.
He actually did that. Like, he actually walked on railroad tracks with a stack of books on his head.
And he would bounce, and I mean, it was.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't sure if he was. I got into the Tibetan monks, the throat singing monks.
Oh yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
And I was wondering if some of what he was doing after I saw that had been part of some research that he'd done. I don't know, but it was fascinating. He just the wealth of Stephen
Information.
Durst.
Yeah. This was a house I needed a place to stay for the night. I don't remember why, and I stayed with Stephen.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a summer night, and it was that house above Highland Park, and he showed me where I was to sleep, and then he went to sleep, in the next room, and I looked in there, and it was a hot summer night, and he slept nude with a dictionary. with a big dictionary, like reading it, and I thought, oh, that's why he knows some words. So like that.
He was his lover.
The big brim hat showed me Taoist hand gestures. Oh, he sang "It Ain't Necessarily So" to me, and that was just kind of coming out of Christian thought, and I just thought, where does he get this song? It ain't necessarily so. Stayed with him one night, top of Highland Park. He took off his clothes at the reptile house. All my memories are him without clothes on. We were after we had reptile house poem readings, right? and then we would go to this breakfast place on 28th Street afterwards. You could talk about anything, right? You know, about poop or whatever, you know. And but I remember I was driving like my Delta 88 and somebody else was driving next to us, and I guess this is just common, like, but Steve mooned us from their car over. Oh, I wanted to talk about the passage of time, the interval when he would recite a lot of stuff. And I saw a picture that Diane had, Diane Walton, of him reciting poetry, and he's doing this thing like this with his hand, with the index and thumb, and he would be like conjuring.
Is it a
up
picture or a
yeah,
painting?
A picture.
A picture.
But he would do this kind of hand gesture, you know, maybe involuntarily. He's kind of like remembering the next line, right? And I just remember one night where like he recited a lot of poetry, and it was all by memory.
Yeah.
And I liked that interval of time, and you know, you got to have that to remember it, you know. And there'd be like these quiet, and he would just wait.
Yeah, well, that was one of the things that I learned from him. He said to all of us Shermits, he said that if you don't memorize your poems and be able to recite them, then you don't really have them. And I think it got all of us to put work into that and be able to recite and not be with our face in the page when we're presenting poetry. Do it the ancient way, right out of your skull. And he was brilliant at that. Thing I'm curious about is his notebooks filled with the list of all the books that he's read. Where are those notebooks, and will that become part of the poetry archive? It could be a master's degree. Just read all these books, and now you've caught up with Stephen. But I remember, this was 20 years ago, that there were numerous, I don't know how many, but numerous of these notebooks, nothing but a list of all the books that he had ever read.
I perceived him as both crazy and advanced, and that he, that some of the things that he was imbuing or teaching or sharing was something I would catch up with later on. And that there was this perception for me of Stephen, of a whole, that him living in a whole other level, of a whole other dimension. I mean, I wasn't around him in his whiskey drinking days at all, but that he was almost like otherworldly. And when I heard from Nancy Francis, whatever, that he had passed away, and then I looked him up on Facebook, I realized that my experience of this time in Twilight Tribe in Grand Rapids was infused with a quality that was Stephen. And that that lives on, that I had caught that quality from him.
He was a drum major for poetry and music and inquiry.
And that just this town, there was a way that this town, and the way he'd walk down the town or play.
Oh yeah, playing the penny whistle while he walked.
Or just his presence in this town was infused. With Stephen, it was like simultaneous. There was no separation between him and Grand Rapids for me at some point.
Well, right. There was Big Fish magazine, of course, which he launched. And, I think it's clear that he was the big fish. It was always one of the curious things, I think, for a lot of us in the art scene in Grand Rapids is why didn't Stephen ever go to New York or L.A. or Berlin, But he was the big fish in the small town.
Well, he and a lot of other people that were big fishes.
Oh, sure. Well, of course, Donna Monroe was there with him in making Big Fish magazine happen, and I would consider her another example of someone who. Why wasn't her stuff published in the New Yorker? Both Stephen and her are examples of how great poets live and die in near anonymity. So many schlocky writers are published and trumpeted. Well, there's those bands, for instance, that are favorited by other musicians, and there's like their fan base is other musicians, and then those are the class of musicians that maybe break big. It seems like Stephen was a writer's writer, a poet's poet, a jazz musician's jazz musician. So his fan base are the perpetuators of what he modeled, not just a passive crowd. So 1,000 years from now, even though you can't do the calculation to see it, there'll still be ripples of that he scribbled something. And other people will scribble things based upon things that were scribbled because Stephen scribbled, and a whole line of poets and thinkers, writers. You will never be able to tease out the math, but there it is,
That's an interesting pull. Like, it's interesting that you're like, he's a poet. He's just a poet. And you're like, he's like
that's what a poet is.
The unacknowledged legislators of the world, someone said. I don't know what I'm quoting there.
They're everywhere. They're in every city.
Did you find a poem you'd like to share?
Very much so. This was published in '92, but it seems that there isn't one that I have thought of that wasn't
current,
the gospel, and that I agreed with. It's hard not to.
Let's hear
it. This last one is Divorce Papers. Why did I speak to you in terms so heady? I can't explain what I was thinking of, since I've forfeited dignity already. I reckon I must live without your love. Who made the rule that love must be a form of ownership and bond security, or else a force like nature, like a storm, rather than just the natural way to be? I cannot tell what I most need from you if you can't hear it with your inner ear. Till you have been unbalanced by the true light's vision, you will never be a seer. Wherefore the plaintiff prays, you'll pardon giddy wits, pity for love, not love for pity. Oh man, this is really some good stuff.